This discussion, the reasons the Ark was concealed from 247 BC until comparatively recently. Noah's Ark has been rediscovered in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat between 3,900 and 4,700 meters above sea level, 4 to 11 meters under the surface of the gorge, under many strata of lithic and ice material. The site is certainly a maritime barge. It matches exactly all the criteria listed by Moses in the Pentateuch, by the Islamic prophet Muhammad in the Quran, and also by Berosus, Josephus, and an account from Alexander the Great. Questions remain why and how Noah's Ark was concealed until comparatively recently. We've discussed the Mount Qardu deception that started at 247 BC. Then we talked about the adoption of the Ark's protection by the Catholicos and the Armenian Apostolic Church. Then we discussed the influence of Mkrtich, Khrimian or Khrimian Khayreg, Papa Khrimian, in terms of exposing more influential, loyal, and helpful foreigners to Noah's Ark, as well as Armenian elites. And then finally, in 1907, the 4 orders that Khrimian gave to conceal the Ark and protect the artifacts. Namely, 1, to cover the tunnels that led to the Ark in the southern gorge. Number 2, to carry all the artifacts the guides could locate to locations in the Kingdom of Georgia, which is now the Republic of Georgia. Number 3, to have Ark guides and their descendants misdirect foreigners away from the Ark's actual location in the southern gorge. And number 4, to continually, every single year, monitor the site, monitor Noah's Ark to ensure that it's not detrimentally affected by foreigners or by natural processes. So at the end of Khrimian's life, he gave these particular orders. And so now what we had is we had a state where our guides and their families possessed hundreds of artifacts from Noah's Ark. I've seen 6 assemblages, but the descendants of the Ark guide said there's as much as 1,500 artifacts that were removed not only from the interior of Noah's Ark, dating to the late Epipaleolithic period, from 13,100 BC to 9,600 BC, but also from the small worship areas that were at the bottom of these tunnels right in front of entrances to Noah's Ark, with artifacts that range from the pottery Neolithic to 1907, which was the final year that the Armenians covered up the tunnels and carried the artifacts to the Republic of Georgia. Khrimian did this in order to protect and conceal the Ark. And it was fortuitous because after the Hamidian Massacre from 1905 to 1909, it was followed by a very serious conflagration between the Armenians and the Ottoman Turks from 1915 to 1916 during World War I. From 1915 to 1916, and then during the Turkish War of Independence from 1920 to 1923, Armenians alleged that Turks killed 1.5 million Armenians. Now, from the Turkish perspective, they say that this was a result of World War I that killed millions of people. But the Turkish government also has to contend with the amount of evidence that showed that Armenians were canalized into pathways and then marched to the northern deserts of Syria, dying along the way during this forced march. It was a terrible situation. Now, I was able to meet one of the descendants of one of the Turkish veterans that was participating in the forced march of Armenians. And first of all, his grandfather said is that they just The Turkish forces, the Ottoman forces, hated the Armenians. They thought that they were a fifth column and would damage Ottoman independence and result in the takeover of Turkey by foreigners. So there was just so much hatred. Also, before this, during the Treaty of Berlin, Mkrtich Khrimian led a delegation to try to separate Eastern Turkey, or what the Armenians believe is Western Armenia, away from the Turks. And this is the area that encompasses Greater Mount Ararat, or Agradagi, or Massis, as it's translated by the Armenians. His grandfather, who was a junior officer, was supervising his section that was controlling the forced march of Armenians. One of the priests was dying of thirst. And in his desperation, he called the officer and he goes, "I have a terrible secret, a secret that you would want to know about. And I'll give it to you just for a cup of water." He was dying of thirst. And so the junior officer said, okay, provided him a cup of water. And the priest told him that Noah's Ark had been a source of income for the militia that acted against Ottoman Turkey and was there in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. Well, the junior officer told the senior officer, or the senior field commander, roughly a major to lieutenant colonel, which was called a bey, about this. And the bey told him to write a report because there was similar information and intelligence that the Armenians had been receiving monies from foreigners that had been to the site, and this was used to facilitate the revolutionary activities by the Armenians in their attempt to gain independence from Ottoman Turkey. But he didn't know what happened to his report or other reports, and the priest sadly died. So here we have the situation, the end result of this terrible tragedy. The Armenians refer to it as the Armenian Genocide, and most Western nations also refer to it as an Armenian Genocide. And Turks called it the collateral damage, or a part of World War I. This terrible tragedy resulted in the artifacts from the Ark being in the Republic of Georgia, the Armenian community absolutely destroyed within Ottoman Turkey, and then later on with the Turkish War of Independence from 1920 to 1923, basically an extirpation of all Armenians, with very few exceptions, within the Republic of Turkey, which is now the Republic of Turkey. Now, the other contingent of Armenians was in Armenia. Now, very briefly, Russia had agreed that Armenians could be part of an independent Armenia, but then reversed course and said that they could not be independent. They would have to be part of the oblast, or province, or state of Armenia within the Kingdom of Russia. Well, World War I, it was a disaster for the Russian Empire. Not only did they lose to Germany, but they sued for peace, and shortly thereafter, the Bolshevik Revolution started, and instead of Russia, the entire area of what was Russia became the Soviet state. And with the initiation of the Bolshevik Revolution, then the leadership of Lenin was followed by the leadership of Joseph Stalin. Now, in 1920 and 21, some very interesting things happened. First of all, 3 individuals were associated with Armenia. Number 1, Lavrenti Beria, who was going to be the leader of the NKVD, was trying to destroy Turkish intelligence networks in Armenia. And who did he use to destroy these networks? He used Armenians. that had to flee from the Turkish onslaught into Armenia. And these individuals could spot Turkish individuals, Turkish customs, or Turkish language dialects that were trying to speak Armenian, but it was given away by their dialect or their accent. And Lavrenti Beria was able to use these Armenian individuals to identify and then assassinate the Turkish intelligence networks. But what Lavrenti Beria learned and transported up the chain of command, especially to Nikolai Yezhov and Stalin, was that there were reports that Armenians, specifically the Catholicos, had received funds from foreigners, namely Americans and Tsarist Russians. And the context was Stalin in 1920 had been put in charge of Soviet forces when Poland invaded the Ukraine. Now, he defeated the Polish forces within Ukraine, but then he went in 1920 into Poland to launch a military assault against Poland and was soundly defeated. But in 1922, even though he was defeated and it was embarrassing, he was promoted to the general secretary, more of an administrative position. But he used this position in the context of Lenin's government to really get an upper hand and really consolidate power within the Soviet state. Eventually, Joseph Stalin assumed control of the Soviet state. And in 1930, he initiated a purge. Now, Beria, Lavrenti Beria, was also from Georgia, or the Oblast of Georgia, like Joseph Stalin, had previously heard reports about Armenians getting large sums of money from Americans and from Tsarist Russians, and this was of prominent concern. Now, Yezhov, Nikolai Yezhov, was the current head of the NKVD during what they called the Great Purge that began in 1930. And he was in charge of what they called a troika, or a three-person group. There was over the judgments and often summary executions of Armenians. And the purges began with the torture and systematic interrogation of Armenians that were involved in collecting monies for Noah's Ark, especially those that had ties to the office of the Catholicos. And as these individuals were tortured, they gave up more names. How much money per person the Catholicos received for these visits to Noah's Ark, which nationality, comprising Tsarist Russian, elite Armenian, and also influential Americans, and what these monies were used for. And most problematic for the Soviet state, they were used for independence initiatives by Armenians to secure independence from Ottoman Turkey. These subjects were sometimes denoted by a reference to a sasud, or korobka, meaning box or container in Russian, or sometimes with a small drawing of a rectangle or square. Soviet interrogators were expressly forbidden to write down Ark, Noah, or any biblical references in the notes for these individuals that were being tortured and executed due to their knowledge of Noah's Ark, association with, or mentioned by, an individual that had knowledge of Noah's Ark. Well, this was a huge problem. Not only there was evidence for foreign involvement in Armenia, but also the larger problem was that there was Noah's Ark, and it was factual in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. Noah's Ark created four dilemmas for the Soviet state. First, the presence of Noah's Ark conflicted with the theories of Marxist-Leninism. It was an existential threat to Marxist-Leninism. Marxist-Leninism says that civilizations develop by a materialistic struggle, what they call the dialectic conflict, from very simple communal societies to feudal societies to capitalist societies and eventually to a communist society. And what started this was competition over resources by very simple communal societies. Noah's Ark absolutely conflicted with this view, because this was not a competition from communal societies. This was an origin from a very advanced, huge maritime barge, showing the apogee or the latest developments from the Stone Age, including the domestication of plants and animals, organization, the origins of ceramic manufacturing that started the Neolithic Revolution, and from Noah's Ark, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you have the origins of an array of different cultures, from the hunters and gatherers to capitalist societies, all competing over resources. So this was an existential threat to Marxist-Leninist theories. The second major problem was that Karl Marx had said that the Bible and the Quran were just a collection of myths, opiates of the people, and were to be discarded as just simple fables. Well, with the presence of Noah's Ark, it wasn't a simple fable. It wasn't an opiate of the masses. It was a tangible proof. The Bible and parts of the Quran were absolutely factual. And this would have created a nightmare for the humanist, secularist, atheist Soviet state. The third issue was that because Armenians were the protectors of the Ark, it highlighted Armenian exceptionalism, that they were a special people. And at the time of the purges, what Stalin and Yezhov and Lavrenti Beria were trying to establish was a Transcaucasus oblast that combined many peoples, not only Armenians, but Georgians and also Azerbaijanis, and they were trying to eliminate nationalist identities. Well, with the efficacy and the reality of Noah's Ark on Greater Mount Ararat, this conflicted with this idea that the Armenians were not special and just part of the Soviet oblast of the Transcaucasus. And the final threat, the most serious, was the Republic of Turkey. Remember, when Stalin was defeated by Polish forces in 1920, who was ascending of power in the Republic of Turkey? Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the father of the Turks. Not only did Atatürk defeat the British, the New Zealanders, and the Australians in the Dardanelles campaign, but then he became the leader of the new Republic of Turkey and oversaw through his generals, many of which would work with him in the Dardanelles, the defeat of the Armenians in the east, defeat of the Greeks in the west, and the defeat of the French and Syrians in the south. So here was a real problem. Not only did you have an energetic and brilliant leader in Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but you also had Noah's Ark that was mentioned so prominently in the Quran. And what Stalin and Yezhov and Lavrenti Beria most feared was that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk would unite the Muslim Ummah, or the supranational aggregation of Muslim peoples. And with Noah's Ark and with the brilliance of Kemal Atatürk and his forward-thinking ideas and military strategies and tactics, Noah's Ark would create a true dire competition for the Soviet state, as Noah's Ark and Eastern Turkey was right on the border for the Soviet state. These four issues were very concerning to Joseph Stalin, Lavrenti Beria, and Nikolai Yezhov. So the most simplistic methodology to employ was extermination, liquidation, of the priests, any lay individuals, the Catholicos, and any archaeologists that had associations with Noah's Ark or knew about Noah's Ark. Consequently, hundreds of lay people whose names were identified during the torture of the priests and other individuals that were associated with the office of the Catholicos were liquidated after very detailed lists were compiled under torture. Armenian priests of the Armenian Apostolic Church were liquidated, were executed. Not only that, but the Catholicos himself was liquidated. Koran I Muradbekian was killed by Soviet torturers, and he died, according to some reports, in a horrible manner. He was garroted to death by taking a thin piece of wire and then twisting it until his Adam's apple broke. Again, under terrible torture to reveal all the individuals, both priests and laity, that knew about Noah's Ark. Another name, and this is very, very sad, was the archaeologist, the first chair of archaeology of Yerevan University that still exists. The chair is there now to this day, namely Asharbek Kalantar. Professor Kalantar knew everything about the Ark, but it was not published because, again, it is the symbol of the Armenian nation, and it was basically a secret archaeological site. But the Soviets took all the artifacts that were at the offices of the Catholicos at the Armenian Apostolic Church, carried them back to Moscow. Professor Kalantar recorded all the artifacts, made a detailed report, and then was promptly executed. Again, because Noah's Ark was so disturbing and such an existential threat to Marxist-Leninism and the Soviet state. So these purges lasted from 1930 till 1938 and were just absolutely devastating for the Catholicos. So what is the end result out of this terrible situation? First, you had the Armenian guides and their families that had carried as much as 1,500 artifacts from Noah's Ark to what is now the Republic of Georgia. Then it was the Kingdom of Georgia. Second, within Ottoman Turkey, you had the intermediaries between the Catholicos in eastern Armenia and the guides in the Republic of Georgia, subject to genocide by Turkish forces. Complete devastation. Third, in eastern Armenia, you have the Catholicos, laity, priests, and the first professor of archaeology and other individuals that had associations with Noah's Ark or knew about Noah's Ark, killed by the Soviet purges. So who else survived? And this is important in terms of the rediscovery of Noah's Ark during the modern era. It was the few Armenian women that represented the families of guides to Noah's Ark that were trapped behind Turkish lines that married Kurdish men, whose families were at the base of Greater Mount Ararat, or Agredagi, in eastern Turkey, or just over the border in northwestern Iran. And from there, the knowledge of Noah's Ark was preserved, its rough location, which led to the rediscovery of Noah's Ark during recent times. Now, why is Noah's Ark important? First of all, it represents a scientific phenomenon, namely the end of the Stone Age, because the site is from the late Epipaleolithic period, 13,100 to 9,600 BC, and represents not only the apogee of the late Stone Age, the latest technological developments, encased in a 158-meter barge, showing the origins and the developments of plant and animal domestication, the origins or the precursors to the development of ceramics, every type of stone tool, and also the development of archaeobotanical materials, every type of cereal grain and legumes that were instrumental not only in the late Epipaleolithic, namely chickpea, pea, and bitter vetch, but also very important during the Neolithic or the farming revolution. Not only that, you have animal byproducts and human hair, where we can all trace our ancestry to DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and other types of genetic inquiries, the origins of all modern animals, plants, and humans. But not only is it important scientifically, Noah's Ark is also a shrine that antedates any of the schism between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It's a sacred shrine to 3 world religions. And that is why we have to protect this site, which is already underway by the Turkish government. But there's a severe need to start conservation of the site, especially the wood architecture and the organic remains, because it's a principal faith of all 3 religions in the efficacy of Noah's Ark, and now Noah's Ark is here. Thank you.